Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
Welcome to Susan Carland in Conversation. This interview is a supplement to Episode 8 in the Australian Journey series, The Australian Way of Life.
The person I'm interviewing today is reasonably familiar to me. He's a huge fan of the Richmond Football Club, the Tigers. This might even be his car. And right now he's hoping to find a seat just a short stroll away inside their very intimate home ground, the MCG. So let's go find him. We're in a stadium of more than 100,000 seats, and you have to choose one of the highest ones for me to climb to.
Well, it's a great view. It's a sensational view. You can't deny the majesty of this, can you?
What are you doing here so early? The game doesn't start till tomorrow night.
I know, I'm a bit nervous. It's Collingwood. It's the old enemy. You've got to prepare for these things. And I'm here just making sure everything's in order.
Well, thank you for joining me, probably because you're my husband. You're a bit scared to say no, but I do appreciate you coming along.
No worries.
We're at the MCG, the mighty MCG,
Yeah.
the home of so many sports games in Australia. It's been said that in Australia, sport is light and everything else is shadow. How mad a sporting nation is Australia?
So, by any measure, pretty mad. And we're in Melbourne at the moment, which would probably be the maddest sporting city, and we're in the middle of a precinct that's one of the most remarkable sporting precincts, because you've got the MCG here and you've got the tennis centre where they play the Australian Open just over there. So this is a country that turns up for sporting events. This is a city that turns up for sporting events. It almost doesn't matter what it is. People will turn up to watch it, especially if it's elite level. The numbers on television are huge. Whenever television stations are sustained by their sports broadcasts, and the amount of money that they will pay for the rights to broadcast these things are astronomical. So it's an obsessive part of Australian culture, but it's more than something that can be measured in attendances and TV audiences and TV rights deals. It's central in the Australian psyche, in the Australian imagination, and I don't know of any. There are other countries that turn up in numbers as significant. There are other countries that watch in numbers as significant. I don't know of any other country that packages itself in sport quite to the same extent as Australians do. We don't boycott anything. We've turned up to every Olympic Games. It doesn't matter who you are or what you're hosting, we'll be there. Our Olympic team looks like a small army. It's huge. So when we come to tell our stories as a nation, and when we come to celebrate our heroes, we don't usually talk about war heroes. We don't talk about artists. We don't talk about scientists. We're not that sort of a country for whatever reason. We talk about sports people. Sports heroes are our national heroes. And so it's so at the centre of the way we conceive of ourselves as a people. And I know that sounds a bit high concept and highfalutin for what is ultimately a series of games, but it's not. That's genuinely the way that Australia works.
We play a lot of different sports in Australia. This is the Melbourne cricket ground. Cricket is huge. We've had the Olympics here. But arguably the most iconic or important sport in Australia is Aussie rules football, the AFL. What are the origins of this game? Where did this come from?
So the first game of Australian rules football was actually played here. This is before this stadium existed. It was played in July 1858 between Melbourne Grammar School and Scotch College, and there's a statue just out the front of this, just over the back of this stand over here that commemorates that game. And this was an experimental thing that they were doing. It was a game that was created by a man called Tom Wills, who was an elite cricketer. He played cricket for the Melbourne Cricket Club and for Victoria, and he also grew up with a lot of Indigenous people. He was a person who took the first ever tour of Indigenous cricketers to England to have a cricket tour. And he was tasked, as a cricketer, with a way of keeping cricketers fit in winter. And this was the worst decision that cricket ever made, because it ended up creating this game, Australian rules football, that has now probably swallowed it as far as, commercial power and access to talent and all that sort of stuff is concerned. But Tom Wills was a very interesting character, because when he was told to keep the cricketers fit, they were suggested maybe they might play rugby. I mean, that's the natural thing to do. For an outpost of the British Empire, you would play a game of the British elite, and rugby union is that game. And he was defiant about this. He was a bit of a wild character, Tom Wills. And so he made this declaration, which, to be honest, is as close as we get in Australia to a Declaration of Independence. When they suggested we play rugby, he says, no, we shall have a game of our own. This was his big statement. All they had to do was invent it. So he came up with this game, and the origins of it are kind of a little bit disputed. Was it just a derivative of rugby? Or did it have some kind of soccer influence? But soccer never really caught on in Australia, so it would be unusual if that were the case. And there is another theory, that's a theory that I prefer, but I can't say it's higher than a theory, which is that it borrows elements of the European logic of sport, goalposts and territory and all that sort of stuff, but it's derived from Indigenous games, which makes sense because of the interaction that Tom Wills had with Indigenous people. He grew up with Indigenous kids and so on, and as a man had a lot of interaction with Indigenous people. And they played a series of games that were actually quite similar in that they have elements of what we now recognise as Australian rules football. So there's a game called Marngrook, for example, where really the objective was to kick a ball up in the air and catch it at the highest point you possibly could. And one of the distinctive features of Australian rules football is high marking, that, those people who climb on each other's backs and catch the ball at its highest point in spectacular fashion. And it's here that you insert spectacular overlay of that happening. Because of this, you can see the fusion of Indigenous influence and European influence. And for a lot of people, that's really the origin of the game. And certainly if you talk to Indigenous footballers, they talk about it as their game. Mm-hmm. And Indigenous players do seem to have this natural affinity for the game and natural flair for the game. It's like they're in tune with it in a way that other people aren't. And even in media, there's a football show, a weekly show devoted to football that is run by Indigenous people, it's fronted by Indigenous people. They have non-Indigenous guests, but it's very Indigenous themed, and it's called the Marngrook Footy Show, named after that Indigenous game. That was, I think anyway, the genesis of this sport that's now the biggest sporting code in the country.
A lot of Indigenous people play Aussie rules football. Yeah. Only about 2% of Australia is Indigenous, yet 10% of the of AFL is made up of Indigenous people. And even this ground has a significance for Indigenous people. Tell us about that.
So this area, this is what we now call Yarra Park, is the whole precinct with the surrounding parks where the cars come and park during game day, and of course the stadium. This was an Indigenous meeting place. And there are sites here that I don't think it would be going too far to say are sacred. There's a tree that is fenced off, and you can see the carvings from where they took wood from it to make a canoe. And so for a lot of Indigenous people, when they come here, they're tapping into something that is more than just the bricks and mortar of a stadium like this. I've got a friend who's a sports journalist, kind of a whimsical style sports journalist at the Age, by the name of Martin Flanagan. And he had this theory that he shared with me. He said, Indigenous players have an amazing record of winning the Norm Smith medal, which is the medal for the best on ground in the grand final, which is always played here every year. And he said there is something about that. There is something about the fact that Indigenous players step onto this ground on the biggest occasion of the year, possibly the biggest occasion of their lives, and they just feel immediately at home, and they settle, and they tune into the game, and they dominate the game. And it's, obviously that's a highly speculative theory, but I think it does speak to something. There is a spiritual connection that goes on here. I would assume for a lot of Indigenous people, but beyond that as well. This is an area, it's to use a cliche, it's a field of dreams, and those dreams span non-Indigenous and Indigenous dreaming. Yeah.
Australia's connection to sport is obviously beyond just Indigenous Australia, and the relationship Australia has to sport has a big connection to the Empire. Yeah. And it was said that sport was Australia's first foreign policy. What does that mean?
So that's a Donald Horne quote, and really it was about the idea that this is a young nation, hasn't really had itself made in the context of a war or anything like that. How does it articulate itself to itself? Well, it does this in relationship to the world through the vehicle of sport, because that's the only vehicle that was really there. And early doors, it was really about the British Empire, let's be honest. So cricket, we haven't spoken much about cricket. You mentioned this is the Melbourne Cricket Ground. This is also the home of the first ever game of Test cricket between Australia and England in 1877. It's just passed, just weeks ago, the 140th anniversary of the birth of Test cricket right here. And Test cricket was a really important thing because it allowed Australia to play against the mother country and possibly win. right? And eventually we did win, and that was the birth of the Ashes because of a famous obituary that was run in the British press once Australia, this piddling little colony on the other side of the world, had managed to vanquish England, the seat of the empire that had invented the game of cricket, and here Australia is beating it. And so there's an obituary run in the British press saying that this is the death of English cricket, and it recommended that the Ashes that it be cremated and the Ashes kept somewhere or other. And that was the birth of the Ashes. And so whenever Australia play England, it's called the Ashes for that reason. And there are ashes in a little urn that live at Lord's in London. And so this sporting rivalry between Australia and England in all sports, but especially in a sport like cricket, which is the sport of the empire, one of the sports of the empire, was such an important way of Australia defining itself in relation to the world, specifically in relation to the British Empire. And so the heroes that Australian sport has turned up, particularly in something like cricket, are very often defined by their deeds against the old enemy, against England. Don Bradman is the classic example of that. Possibly the most famous sportsman for Australians, the most iconic, one of the most incredible sportsmen in the history of sport when you look at where his records sit in relation to who's second best in his discipline. It's so far ahead of anyone else. It's really a remarkable story. But one of the reasons that he becomes so iconic is he is a symbol of defiance, but also success against the mother country during the Depression, when England is presuming to lecture Australia on frugality in the Depression, and at the same time playing on the cricket field and playing in a way that was in violation of the spirit of the game. And there is Don Bradman standing up to them, scoring runs that nobody has ever seen, demonstrating to the mother country that we are as good as you. And so he becomes a symbol of all the things that a young nation like Australia could possibly imagine itself to be in the face of this old, almost immemorial nation of Britain that gave birth to us, but is still somehow distinct. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not just the British Empire. I think it's also the world. And I think here the Olympics become really important. So for Australia, doing well at the Olympics really matters. We don't have to top the medal tally. That will never happen. But we have to do better than our population suggests we should. And that you have to punch above our weight. That's the phrase that we will always use. And it's important because it seems like it's the only way we can measure where we sit in the entire world, by competing against the world and being better at something than we should by rights be. Tennis was a similar sort of thing, and now the fact that we don't produce world-beating tennis players like we used to is a bit of a concern. So sport has always been that vehicle because we haven't had military history to draw on, or we haven't had other forms of nation building to draw on to try to articulate our prominence within the world. Sport's kind of been it, and that's how it's been our foreign policy.
When people choose their AFL team of who to support, you follow Richmond, for example.
Yeah.
Is that because you lived around Richmond growing up? How do people choose the team that they follow?
Oh, these things are inherited. You don't get a choice, and it's one of the gravest civic sins you could commit in Australia to change your football team. I know a handful of people who've done it. I no longer speak to them. So the way it works usually is that football persuasion is inculcated within family. You can have divided families where mum barracks for one team and dad barracks for another and they fight over the kids, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, this is handed down. You go to the football with your parents, you watch a given team, you don't realise you support a team until it's too late, basically. I don't remember ever not supporting Richmond. That was just the thing. In my case, it was my brother. My parents were migrants from Egypt. They didn't really follow football very closely. My brother really did. And by the time I came along, he's older than me by about 10 years, and by the time I came along, the die was already cast. But that's the way that it tends to work. For other people, though, it was a local thing. And if you look at a league like the AFL, which is the premier Australian Football League, it grew out of the VFL, the Victorian Football League. So if you look at the teams, half of them are suburbs in Melbourne: Richmond, Collingwood, Essendon. The Western Bulldogs used to be Footscray. You've got Carlton, North Melbourne, all these sort of teams. Now, these are just suburbs. And a bit like in the NRL in Sydney, grew out of the New South Wales Rugby League, and a lot of the teams have been named after suburbs in Sydney. Manly, Canterbury, Bankstown, South Sydney, Balmain became West Tigers when they merged with Western Suburbs, on and on it goes. So there were localities that were really driving this. if you grew up in Richmond, you barracked for Richmond, and it was a working class Catholic suburb, and Richmond was a working class Catholic club. There were Protestant Catholic rivalries between teams for that reason, that certain areas were Protestant, certain weren't, certain were Catholic. There were rivalries that were socio-economic. Carlton and Collingwood hate each other because Collingwood was a working class slum just up the road from here, and Carlton's the suburb next door that's where all the Silver Spoons lived, right? And so this rivalry is born out of those things. So there are old school rivalries, there are roots that are connected to the soil, that are local and geographical, but then it grows beyond that because there's a lot of social mobility in a city like Melbourne. People move all over the place, and so the geographic centres for certain clubs, as far as their supporters are concerned, is often miles away. So Richmond's geographic centre, as far as its supporters are concerned, is somewhere out in Glen Waverley, for example, because these things become inherited through generations.
Is the class element still a big part of the way people view football? Now, football is such a massive, multi-million-dollar industry. The teams have buckets of cash. This stadium would have cost however many zillions to build.
Yeah.
Does it still have those class roots?
I think it does in its mythology. So people still will make jokes about Collingwood supporters not having teeth, which is a very working class sort of sneer. Or a sneer of the working class. And people will still talk about Carlton as though they are the Silver Spoons. The reality is that Collingwood is a highly gentrified, extremely expensive suburb to live in now. It's an inner city, very trendy sort of a place. Carlton is still expensive. Richmond was a working class suburb, also now very expensive real estate. If you're interested in the real estate market, I can fill you in on that. So the class elements are still there in the mythology, but I don't think they're manifest on the ground so much, with the exception of the stories that can be told about the players. So the top players are paid, not by world standards very well, but certainly by local standards very well. Probably the highest paid player in the AFL would be on something like $1.2 million a year, which is not an insignificant amount of money, right? It's entirely possible that that person grew up in a housing commission, or has parents, one of whom is in a bikie gang, or at one time in their life was sleeping in a car, because that's all, and these are specific people I'm thinking of as I tell these stories, right? So those class elements, those sort of stories of rags to riches and of being down and out to becoming a hero of the people, they're still there. What is not there are the stories of people who come and dominate at the MCG on a Saturday, and then on Monday are laying pipes somewhere because they're a plumber or they're a PE teacher or anything like that. Those stories have gone through the era of professionalisation. But that's not that long ago, actually. Mm-hmm. Like in the 80s, you had people who would play here who were doing regular jobs. Kevin Sheedy, one of the most famous names in the game as a coach and as a player, coached Essendon for, it seems like, forever, played for Richmond, won premierships at Richmond. There's a famous piece of audio of his coach, Tommy Hafey, when he was playing for Richmond, yelling at him because he was trying to be too fancy. And he said, "I want you to be a back pocket plumber." Because he played in the back pocket, a very unfashionable position on the ground in the defensive 50, and he was a plumber. And that was the story that surrounded him. Those stories were there. We're starting now to see a small revival of that, though, with the creation of the Women's League. And this is one of the most interesting things about the Women's League is it's not really a professional league. They're not paid terribly much. It's a short league. A lot of the people haven't played that many football games. They're elite athletes, but they're not elite footballers. But now they're the ones who have the story of being a PE teacher during the week and then having to come and play in the women's grand final or whatever it is. And it's evoking this kind of nostalgic element of the class dimensions of football, but also the way that the story of our entire society can be told through the 36 people who happen to be on the field at a given point in time.
The Women's League's just started.
Yeah.
It's surprised the AFL with how successful it's been, how popular it's been. What do you think this developing new Women's AFL League, what does that tell us about the changing Australian society or how people are viewing sport?
Well, women's sport is no doubt having a real moment at the moment. And it's not just about the Women's AFL. You've seen a Women's League created in what the rest of the world calls football and we call soccer. That's called the W League. You've seen the Matildas, our soccer team, do extremely well, win a knockout game at the World Cup, which is the first time an Australian soccer team has done that. There's a lot of momentum behind that. Women have held up more than half the sky in the Olympics in Australian history ever since we've been in the Olympics. And our female sporting heroes, there are a lot of women among them in sports like tennis and in swimming, especially the Olympic sports. But there was always a bit of a gap in that the football codes didn't do that. That was a manly thing that men did, and they were watched by women, but women were certainly not participating. And in fact, if you were a girl who was interested in playing football, you got to about 13 and you were told you couldn't do it anymore because you couldn't play in mixed teams after 13. It was too dangerous, or whatever the reasoning might be. But the idea of gender equality is really, it's becoming a popular idea, not just an idea that's got momentum, but an idea that is popular. It's almost like it's becoming part of the Australian self-image, this idea of gender equality, and that's becoming expressed through sport. And so the Women's League has come along, the Australian Women's Football League has come along at a moment where there's just so much inevitable momentum behind the idea of women's equality, but that being expressed through women's sport. And so the moment was right. There was a lot of anticipation for this, and it almost didn't matter then the peripheral questions around what the standard exactly would be, and where the games would be played, and all of this sort of stuff, how the league would be structured. All that became irrelevant. The fact is, it was here. And opening night, the first game between Carlton and Collingwood, as it happens, played at Carlton's old home ground where they no longer play home games. It was a lockout. They had to lock people out because too many people wanted to come and watch it. And it tapped into it hit all those nostalgic nerves that people had, where it was played, the old clubs playing in suburban venues, the footballers having these stories I was saying before about, being part-time and having other things outside football that make them very much like us when they're playing. All those stories were there. And so it's really tapped into a moment that is now, but also a moment that is past and lost. And it's the union of those moments that's created a real magic around the league, I think.
Does everybody in Australia support and play AFL? Is that the national sport, or are there differences between states?
There are differences. Probably the only national sport really would be cricket. I suppose tennis as well, and then Olympics generally. But no, it's actually quite geographic. So this is the home of Australian rules football. This is where the first game was played. This is where the grand final is played. But it dominates Melbourne. It's massive in Adelaide, South Australia. It's massive in Perth, in WA. It's big in the Northern Territory, particularly amongst Indigenous communities there. But you go to Sydney, so you go to New South Wales, particularly northern New South Wales or central and up, and you go to Queensland, and suddenly you are in an area where this is a minority sport, where following this sport is a bit of a strange thing to do, although it's growing. Those areas, that is rugby territory. It is territory for the rugby codes, by which I mean both rugby league, which is the more popular code here and the bigger code in Australia, and rugby union, which is the code that is very much a private school code. The Wallabies play that. It's probably the more international game, and the All Blacks are dominating that, and there's a rivalry between the Wallabies and the All Blacks, so Australia and New Zealand. It's probably the one area where New Zealand has it all over Australia. We beat them in cricket all the time. We generally beat them in rugby league. We beat them in netball mostly, or at least more often than not. But when it comes to rugby union, we haven't got a hope. It's now just become a complete landslide. But what's interesting about this is I think through these differences in attachment to sporting codes, you can tell the differences between the cities. So Melbourne is a city where Australian rules football dominates to a massive extent. Everyone is expected to be into it. If you have just arrived in Melbourne from overseas and you turn up to your job, someone will eventually ask you, who do you barrack for? And if you don't have an answer to that question, they will give you an answer to that question, right? They'll ask you where you live. I live in Essendon. Oh, the Bombers, you barrack for the Bombers, and then you're away, right? That's the way it works. If you run an art gallery in Melbourne, you are still expected to have a football team, and if you get a ticket to the grand final, you will turn up, and you'll probably turn up in the middle of winter to watch a game that's inconsequential, right? That's just expected. It traverses class. A secretary can tease their boss about the fact that their team won. This is, and they will have a coherent, meaningful conversation. A meeting of minds will happen about that. And so, that's a symbol, I think, for the way that Melbourne is, by and large, a pretty well-integrated city. People move around a lot. Class differences are not as significant. It's more cosmopolitan in its political culture. All of these things. You go to Sydney or you go up to Queensland, and there is a very clear class differential in the game that you choose to follow. Rugby league is something that working class people play and working class people follow. It has a working class culture. It speaks to a working class audience. That's what it is. And if you go to a private school, you would play rugby union. But there's a bit of oil and water about this. Even though you do find players do swap codes a little bit, there is a very clear distinction that takes place here. Also, you don't have this pervasive sense of those codes mattering across the whole society. If you run an art gallery in New South Wales, you're not necessarily into rugby league. In fact, it would probably be a bit strange if you were into rugby league. Maybe union if you happen to know somebody who knew a player or something like that. But these things are kind of quite separate. And that does, I think, reflect something of the sociology of Sydney. That Sydney is a city where people live in pockets, where people don't travel as much. There's too much water, there's too many hills, it's hard to get around. And so there is more of a class distinction. There are more distinct communities that gather around these social institutions. And so Australian rules football can kind of make claim to being the national game because it's our only Indigenous game. It's the only game we've invented. But also it dominates the societies that it prevails in to such an extent that it does form part of the national psyche in a way that other codes probably don't as much.
Sport's the theatre where society will often play out its issues.
Yeah.
Are there any recent significant social issues you've seen played out on the theatre of sport?
It's happening endlessly. But probably the darkest chapter that's recent emerged concerning a footballer, Australian rules footballer who plays for the Sydney Swans, or did until he retired, by the name of Adam Goodes. He's an Indigenous man. He was named Australian of the Year, not just because he's a good footballer, but because of all his community work in Indigenous communities. And he went through this period where he was just being relentlessly booed every time he went near the ball by opposition supporters. Now, players getting booed is not a new thing, it happens all the time. If they've done something on the field that's a bit dirty, the other team's supporters will boo them. If they used to play for your team and now they're playing for someone else, you will boo them. That's the pantomime of sport. This wasn't pantomime. It was pretty clear pretty early on that this was racially motivated. And it comes down to an event that happened at this very ground, actually. So just over here, if you see where the grey seats start to meet the light blue seats, just to the left in that grey seat area, he was there, I think about to take a free kick, and there was a Collingwood fan. It was a Sydney Collingwood game. There was a Collingwood fan sitting there who leaned over the fence and screamed at him and called him an ape. And instead of doing what a million Indigenous footballers have done in the past and just walk away, he stopped and made a stand about that. And he pointed out the girl, who's a supporter, and told security about it, and she and her mother were removed. And this became a big story because in the aftermath, a lot of people felt that Adam Goodes had victimised this girl who was 13 years old at the time. The full story is actually far more complicated than that. He met her. He told her a lot of he told her why what she said was offensive. She apologised. She wrote a letter to him actually saying, "I've learnt so much through this." It was actually a very convivial exchange in the end, and he gave a press conference, I think the next day, where he said, "This is not about this little girl. Don't give her a hard time. It's not about this. This is about an undercurrent of racism that's existed in Australia for a long time, and we need to talk about this, right? But don't pick on her." He was very clear about that. The mythology of, sensationalist media turned this into him picking on a 13-year-old little girl, even though he was at pains to say that's what he wasn't doing. Then he wins Australian of the Year, and I think a lot of people in the end resent that fact, that a person like this, an Indigenous person who plays football, who stood up for himself like this, can win Australian of the Year. And he's seen as a divisive figure, even though I think any fair reading of him says he's anything but divisive. And so when you have him running around, he's a champion footballer, by the way, too. He's won the Brownlow medal, he's all Australian representation, he's won premiership, he's done it all. And for a player like that, as decorated as that, to be booed like that, was really confronting for a lot of people. And what was especially confronting was how slow the football community and the AFL that's running the competition were to react to that, to make a statement about that. How slow other players were to make a stand about that. I mean, imagine if other players had decided that the minute there is booing, they're going on strike and walking off the ground. Imagine something like that. You didn't have that. So it was a big wound, I think, for the AFL, because the AFL had seen itself as a leader of social progress. It had won a United Nations award for its racial vilification policy back in the 90s after another incident that was racially motivated on this ground on an Anzac Day, in an Anzac Day game. It had done all this. It had introduced a code where fans would be ejected from the stadium for racial abuse. There is a sign over there, report antisocial behaviour, text 0409 117 621. That began because of its racial vilification code. It's proud of this. And then a moment like this arrives and it reveals that all the progress that the AFL thought it had made suddenly wasn't there, and that the football community wasn't instantly ready to stand by its person, to acknowledge this for what it was, that is, not to make excuses and say it was booing of another kind, and then to stand up and make a statement about this. It took a very long time. It got to the point where Adam Goodes felt he'd been so bullied as a result that he withdrew from games. He didn't play. He missed 1 or 2 games from what you might call a psychological injury, and that was a really dark moment. And when he came back to play, there was a lot of nervous energy about whether or not he'd get booed again. And there was a little bit, but not much. Thankfully, he got through that. When he retired at the end of the season, he didn't end up doing the customary lapse of honour that retired players do. It was a very sad moment, and I think it probably still hurts him. But it is through this theatre that Australia gets to have conversations about reconciliation or about race relations that it often is not very good at having in Parliament. That's one of the ironies of this, and that's why that episode, I think, stands out for a lot of people, not just in the game, but in the national mythology.
The grand final, the ultimate game for AFL, is played every year here in this ground that really reminds one of the Coliseum.
Yeah.
What does it feel like when you are here in the ground with 100,000 other people at the biggest moment of the year? Your team runs out to play in the biggest match of the year. What does that feel like?
Why would you ask me that question? Why would you? You know my team has never been in the grand final. You're just stoking me now.
I forgot.
You forgot? You know you didn't forget. Oh no, that hurts so much.
Well, I guess the good thing with AFL is every year there's always a chance next year.
Yeah,
Maybe this will be Richmond's year.
There is always next year, and it is always not our year, as it turns out. But I have been to a couple of grand finals, and I can tell you the atmosphere, the roar, the size of the roar when the team comes out, because it's a gladiatorial sport in its way. It's dangerous. It's very physical. And teams go out there, and the metaphors of war are never far away, even however inappropriate they might be, they're never far away. And so when your team comes out and it is all on the line on that day, the level of tension and nervous energy and excitement and even just rageful anticipation, it reaches a point that very few other spectacles in our community can reach. I remember, as a Richmond supporter, we haven't made the grand final for a long time, never since I was sentient, but I have seen us make finals, so finals that come before the grand final. And a few years ago, our players came out. We hadn't been in the finals for 13 years. They ran out onto this ground. 95,000 people were here. It was against Carlton, one of the teams we hate, old enemy. And the roar was so deafening. I've never heard anything like it. It tapped into frequencies I didn't know the human ear could pick up. And players after the game spoke about how when they ran out onto this ground, it wasn't just the roar. The vibrations from the roar, they could feel the ground shaking. Can you imagine what that must be like for a player about to play a very significant game? They're nervous anyway, and then to feel that happen. As it happened, Richmond, who were a much better team than Carlton that year, got to a 6-goal lead, then choked and fell over and lost in one of the most heartbreaking losses the club must ever have sustained.
Sounds like you're not over it.
I'm certainly not over it. But I can't help but think that all that energy, all that anticipation that went there, and it was overwhelmingly Richmond's energy because of the long drought that they'd had before being here and the huge supporter base they have. I can't help but think that played some part in making their day just impossible to wrangle, that at some point the emotion just overcame them and they fell over, because this is a place that injects emotion and does emotion like very, very few theatres in the world. And I'm saying that fully aware of the role that soccer plays in so many communities around the world. There is something very, very special that goes on here.
Well, Eve, thank you so much for your time today, for this enlightening chat. I guess the only
No
thing we can say now, quietly, we don't want to scare the players, is go Tigers!
Go Tigers! I'm actually nervous tomorrow night. I'm very nervous. I'm going to get back to watching the grass.